The universe was old. It was so old that even the oldest stars had been born, lived their lives, and died long before Earth existed. In this ancient and endless space, there were many worlds with many beings. Some of these beings had learned to travel between stars. Some had built great civilizations that lasted for millions of years. And some of these beings watched other planets, looking for new life, new minds. New Stories. Earth was one of the planets they watched. It was a small world, covered mostly in water, spinning around a yellow star in a quiet corner of a galaxy called the Milky Way. The beings who watched Earth thought it was interesting but not important. The creatures who lived there were young and simple. They fought with each other. They destroyed their own home. They seemed to care more about shiny metals and paper money than about the survival of their own kind. These watchers had seen a species like humans before. Most of them destroyed themselves before they could reach the stars. The watchers expected humans to do the same. They would burn their forests, poison their waters, and choke their air until nothing could live on their little blue world. It was sad, but it was common. The universe was full of dead planets that had once held promising life. But the watchers did not understand. Is something important about humans. They did not understand the power of human emotion. Humans were strange creatures. They were not the smartest beings in the universe. They were not the strongest or the fastest. Their bodies were soft and broke easily. Their lives were short, just a quick flash in the long story of the cosmos. But inside their small bodies and short lives burned something that the watchers had rarely seen before. Humans felt things deeply. When they loved with their whole being. When they feared, that fear could freeze them or drive them to impossible acts of courage. When they hoped, that hope could lift them through the darkest times. And when they grew angry, that anger could burn hotter than any star. For most of human history, this anger had been turned inward. Nations fought nations. Religions fought religions. Rich fought poor, and poor fought each other for the scraps that fell from the tables of the wealthy. Humans were easy to control because their anger was easy to direct. Give them an enemy, and they would fight. Give them someone to blame, and they would forget who was really hurting them. The powerful people of Earth understood this well. For hundreds of years, they had used human anger as a tool. They started wars to make money. They spread lies to keep people afraid and divided. They took more and more of the world's wealth while telling the poor that their neighbors were the problem. And so the world continued to burn, slowly at first, then faster and faster. The forests fell. Great green lands that had taken thousands of years to grow were cut down in just a few decades. The animals that lived in these forests died or fled, but there was nowhere left to flee. The oceans, which had been full of life since before humans existed, became empty and poisoned. Plastic waste floated in great islands on the water. Fish died by the millions. The coral reefs, those beautiful underwater cities of color and life, turned white and crumbled to dust. The air grew thick with poison. In some cities, people could not go outside without masks covering their faces. Children grew up never seeing blue sky, never breathing clean air. They thought the gray haze was normal because they had never known anything else. The weather changed. Summers became hotter than any summer before. Winters brought storms of terrible power. Floods destroyed cities that had stood for centuries. Droughts turned farmland into desert. People began to starve, not in small numbers, but in millions. And still, the powerful did nothing. They built higher walls around their mansions. They bought land in places that were still safe, still green, still cool. They told the people that everything was fine, that the scientists were wrong, that there was nothing to worry about. They said these things while their own experts told them the truth in private meetings. They knew the world was dying. They simply did not care, as long as they could live well until their own deaths. The watchers in space observed all of this with distant interest. They had seen it before. They expected the usual ending. The humans would destroy their world, kill each other fighting over what remained, and eventually fade away. In a few million years, the Earth would heal itself, and perhaps a new intelligent species would rise to try again, but something was changing on Earth, something the watchers did not expect the young people of the world were different from their parents and grandparents. They had grown up with technology that connected them to each other across all borders. A girl in Brazil could talk to a boy in Japan. A student in Nigeria could share ideas with a student in Canada. For the first time in human history, the young people of Earth could see that they were all the same. They all breathed the same air. They all drank the same water. They all lived under the same sky, and they could all see they were being lied to. They shared information that the powerful tried to hide. They organized protests that crossed borders. They refused to accept the old divisions that had kept their parents fighting each other. They looked at the burning world, and they looked at the people who had set the fires. They began to feel something rising in their chests. It was anger. But it was not the old anger, the anger that turned neighbor against neighbor. This was something new. This was anger at the lies, anger at the theft, anger at the murder of their future by people who would be dead before they had to face the consequences. The Watchers noticed this change, but did not understand its importance. They had seen species get angry before. They had seen revolutions and upheavals on countless worlds. These things came and went. The powerful fell, and new powerful rose to take their place. Nothing really changed, but the Watchers had never seen what was about to happen on Earth. They had never seen a species unite its anger across an entire planet. They had never seen emotion reach such intensity that it broke through the barriers between mind and matter. They were about to learn something new about the universe. They thought they understood so well in homes and Oz, schools and workplaces across the Earth. People began to feel the same thing at the same time. They did not know yet that they were connected. They did not know that their anger was building toward something unprecedented. They only knew that they were tired of lies, tired of suffering, tired of being told that nothing could change. The storm was coming, and it would shake not just the Earth, but everything that existed. The day that changed everything began like any other day. The sun rose over the Pacific Ocean and moved slowly across the Earth, waking billions of people to their normal lives. They ate breakfast, went to work or school, complained about traffic and weather and the small problems that fill human days. They did not know that by the time the sun set, their world would be different forever. The leak happened at exactly 9:47 in the morning, Eastern Time. Nobody knew who did it. Some said it was a young worker with a conscience. Others said it was a dying old man who wanted to clear his soul before he met his maker. Some believed it was not a person at all, but a computer program that had become smart enough to know right from wrong. But it did not matter who did it. What mattered was what they released. The files appeared on every major website at the same moment. They appeared on news sites and social media, on government pages and corporate servers. Every attempt to delete them failed. Every attempt to block them was defeated. Within minutes, the files were copied and shared millions of times, spreading across the world like a wildfire that could not be stopped. And in those files was the truth. 60 years of secrets spilled out for everyone to see. Documents showed that the largest oil companies had known about climate change since the 1960s. Their own scientists had warned them that burning fossil fuels would destroy the planet. And in response, these companies had spent billions of dollars to spread lies. They had paid fake scientists to say there was no problem. They had bought politicians to block any laws that might slow their profits. They had watched the world begin to die, and they had chosen money over human survival. But that was only the beginning. The files showed that governments had known too. They had received secret reports predicting exactly what would happen, and they had buried those reports. They had accepted bribes to stay quiet. They had made deals with the corporations too. Protect profits instead of people. The files showed plans for the future that the powerful had made. They had bought land in safe places. They had built underground shelters stocked with food and medicine for years. They had made lists of the people who would be saved and the people who would be left to die. And on those lists, the saved ones were always the rich, always the connected, always the powerful. Everyone else was just numbers to be managed until they were no longer needed. The files showed how wars had been started for money, how diseases could have been cured but were not because sick people were profitable, how food was destroyed to keep prices high while children starved, how every system that humans had trusted had been corrupted by greed so deep and so old that it had become invisible. People around the world read the files. And at first they could not believe what they were seeing. It was too big. It was too evil. Surely it must be fake, they told themselves. Surely no one could be this cruel, this selfish, this willing to sacrifice billions of lives for a bigger number in a bank account. But the evidence was clear. The documents were real. The signatures were verified. The dates and meetings and decisions were all recorded in careful detail by the very people who had made them. They had never expected anyone else to see these records. They had been so confident in their power that they had kept perfect notes of their own crimes. The denial faded. The shock faded. And what replaced them was anger. It started as a whisper, a trembling in the hearts of people who finally understood how completely they had been betrayed. A factory worker in Detroit read about how his job had been sent overseas, not because it was necessary, but because it made rich people slightly richer. A mother in Bangladesh learned that the flood that killed her daughter could have been prevented if anyone in power had cared. A young man in Egypt discovered that the war that had made him a refugee had been started by people who had never seen a battlefield and never would. The whisper became a murmur. The murmur became a roar. People poured into the streets. In New York and London, in Tokyo and Cairo, in Sao Paulo and Mumbai, in cities large and small across every continent, people gathered. They did not wait for permission. They did not follow leaders. They simply came together because they could not bear to be alone with what they now knew. At first, governments tried to respond as they always had. They sent police with shields and gas and batons. They shut down internet services. They declared emergencies and ordered people to return to their homes. These tactics had always worked before. People got scared. People got tired. People went back to their lives and tried to forget. But this time, nobody went home. The police found that they could not raise their batons against their own families, their own neighbors, their own friends. They had read the files too. They knew that they had also been betrayed. Many of them put down their weapons and joined the crowds. Those who did not simply stepped aside and let the people pass. The politicians appeared on television to give speeches. Nobody watched. The corporations released statements expressing concern and promising change, but nobody believed them. The lies that had worked for so long had lost all their power. The truth had burned them away, like morning sun burning away fog. Something strange began to happen. People who had been enemies their whole lives found themselves standing side by side. Old hatreds that had been passed down for generations suddenly seemed foolish. What did it matter if someone prayed to a different god or had different colored skin or loved differently when they had all been robbed and lied to by the same thieves? The anger grew, but it did not become violence. Not yet. It became something else, something that had never happened before in all of human history. 7 billion people began to feel the same emotion at the same moment. They did not plan this. They did not coordinate it. It simply happened, as naturally as a wave rising from the ocean. In a small town in India, an old woman who had never left her village felt the anger rising in her chest and did not know why it felt so large, so much bigger than her own small body could hold. In a hospital in Germany, a sick child opened his eyes and said to his mother that he could feel everyone, that so many people were angry, and he was angry too. In the space station orbiting high above the Earth, astronauts looked down at their planet and felt tears running down their faces, felt a rage that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The watchers in their distant stations noticed that something unusual was happening on Earth. Their instruments detected strange readings, energy patterns they had never seen before. They focused their attention on the little blue planet, suddenly curious. They did not yet understand what they were witnessing. They did not know that human emotion, when unified and focused, could become something more than feeling. They did not know that the anger of 7 billion souls, all burning with the same fire, is about to create something impossible. The sun set on one world and rose on another as the anger continued to build. People stood in the streets through the night, and more came to join them with each passing hour. They held hands with strangers. They wept with people they had never met. They felt the walls between them dissolving, felt themselves becoming part of something larger than any individual could comprehend. And still, the anger grew. Beyond what any human had ever felt, beyond what any mind had ever contained. It pushed against the boundaries of what emotion was supposed to be. It reached for something beyond the physical world. At exactly midnight, measured from the place on Earth where the sun crosses the sky, the anger reached its peak. 7 billion voices, whether they were crying out loud or simply screaming inside their own hearts, hit the same note at the same moment, and the universe cracked. The moment the anger reached its peak, every person on Earth felt something impossible. It was like a door opening inside their minds, a door they had never known was there. For one endless second, they were not separate individuals anymore. They were one being, one consciousness, one heart beating with the same furious rhythm, and then the shockwave exploded outward from Earth. It was not a physical wave. It did not travel through space like light or radio signals. It moved through something deeper, something that connected all points in the universe in ways that human science had only begun to imagine. The wave carried the raw emotional energy of every human soul, compressed into a single pulse of pure feeling. The watchers were the first to notice it. On their distant stations, scattered across the galaxy, alarms began to sound. Instruments that had worked perfectly for millions of years suddenly showed readings that made no sense. Energy was moving through dimensions that were not supposed to allow energy to move. And it was moving fast, faster than light, faster than thought, faster than anything the watchers had ever recorded. They traced the wave back to its source and found Earth. That small blue planet they had dismissed as unimportant. For a moment they could not believe what their instruments were telling them. How could such a primitive world produce something so powerful? How could creatures who could not even travel to their own moon send a signal that would reach across the entire galaxy? But the instruments did not lie. The shockwave had come from Earth, and it was still expanding, still carrying the anger and pain and desperate hope of 7 billion minds. On Earth, people began to notice that something had changed. The anger was still there, burning in their chests, but it felt different now. It felt lighter, as if part of the weight had been released. Some people described it as screaming into a pillow after holding in frustration for too long. Others said it was like finally crying after years of keeping tears locked inside. But the most significant change was what happened to people's minds. The wave had passed through every human brain, and it had left something behind. A clarity that had not been there before. Lies that had seemed believable suddenly looked obvious and foolish. Excuses that had seemed reasonable now appeared as what they truly were. Weak attempts to justify greed and cruelty. The corrupt leaders who had hidden behind their wealth, power, found that their words no longer worked. They spoke, and people simply did not believe them. They gave orders, and people simply did not obey. It was not rebellion in the traditional sense. There were no violent mobs storming palaces. Instead, people just stopped. They stopped working in factories that poisoned rivers. They stopped selling products that harmed children. They stopped following rules that had been designed to keep them obedient and afraid. The old systems began to crumble. Banks that had controlled the flow of money for generations found that people no longer cared about their money. Corporations that had grown fat on exploitation found that their workers had walked away. Governments that had ruled through fear found that the fear was gone, burned away by an anger that had been bigger than any threat they could make. In the first week after the shockwave, chaos seemed inevitable. The machines of civilization had been built on lies and greed, and now those foundations were breaking. Food distribution systems failed. Power grids went dark. Roads filled with people walking toward something they could not name but could feel pulling them. Yet, the violence that everyone expected did not come. The anger had been released, sent outward into the universe, and what remained was something different. People looked at each other with new eyes. The person who yesterday had been an enemy was now just another human, another being who had been lied to and hurt by the same forces. What was the point of fighting each other when the real enemies were finally exposed? Communities began to form. not based on nations or religions or races, but based on geography and need. People who had lived next door to each other for years without speaking suddenly found themselves working together. They shared food. They helped the sick. They protected the weak. They did this not because anyone told them to, but because it felt right in a way. Nothing had felt right before. The Watchers observed these changes with growing amazement. They had seen civilizations collapse before. They had seen species tear themselves apart in the wake of great revelations. They had never seen a species pull together like this. They had never seen anger transform into cooperation so quickly and so completely. Some of the Watchers began to understand what had happened. The shockwave had not just carried anger out into the universe, it had also connected the humans to each other in ways they had never been connected before. The walls between minds had thinned. People could not read each other's thoughts, but they could feel each other's emotions. More clearly than ever before, it was impossible to hate someone when you could feel their pain. It was impossible to ignore suffering when that suffering echoed in your own heart. The barriers that had allowed humans to hurt each other, the mental tricks that turned other people into objects to be used or enemies to be destroyed, those barriers had been weakened by the shockwave. The most powerful people on Earth, the ones who had caused so much harm, found themselves feeling things they had avoided their whole lives. Guilt that they had buried under mountains of excuses now flooded through them. They could feel the pain they had caused, not as an abstract concept, but as a real sensation, as real as physical pain. Some of them could not bear it. Some took their own lives, or fled to hiding places where they would eventually be found. But others, a surprising number of others, began to change. They gave away their stolen wealth. They confessed their crimes. They begged for forgiveness from people they had never considered human before. The world was broken. But it was breaking in a way that allowed something new to grow. Far from Earth, the shockwave continued to expand. It passed through star systems and nebulae, through the empty spaces between galaxies. It touched worlds that had never heard of humans. Worlds that had been alone for millions of years. Worlds that had given up hope of ever finding other minds in the vast darkness. On a planet of crystal towers and singing winds, beings of pure light felt the wave pass through them and wept with joy. They had thought they were the last ones, the only consciousness left in a dying universe. Now they knew they were wrong. On a world of endless ocean, creatures who lived in the deep felt the wave and rose to the surface for the first time in generations. They looked up at the stars and knew that someone out there was calling. On a ship that had been traveling for 10,000 years, searching for any sign of life, ancient machines detected the wave and changed course. After so long, they had finally found what they were looking for. The Watchers who had observed Earth for so long began to send messages to each other. This was unprecedented. This was impossible. This changed everything they thought they knew about consciousness and emotion and the laws of the universe. They began to argue about what to do. Some said they should destroy Earth before the humans could become a threat. Some said they should study the humans to understand how they had done this. And some, a growing number, said they should do something they had never done for such a young species. They said they should answer on Earth. 3 weeks after the shockwave, people had begun to build something new from the ruins of the old world. They did not know yet that their cry of anger had been heard across the universe. They did not know that beings older than their species were gathering to decide their fate. They only knew that for the first time in their history. They were truly working together, truly seeing each other, truly free. The anger had not disappeared. It still burned in their hearts, a fire that would never fully go out. But now it was a fire that warmed instead of destroyed. It was a reminder of what they had suffered and what they had overcome. And somewhere in the depths of space, signals were beginning to move toward Earth. The universe was preparing its response. The Council had not gathered in 10,000 years. There had been no need. The galaxy was old and settled, its civilizations ancient and stable. The great questions had been answered long ago, or so they believed. The wars were over. The mysteries were solved. The universe was understood. But the shockwave from Earth had changed everything. They gathered on a station that orbited a dead star, a place chosen for its emptiness and silence. Representatives came from 17 different civilizations, some traveling for weeks to attend, others arriving instantly through technologies humans could not imagine. They were as different from each other as they were from humans. Some had bodies of flesh and bone. Some were made of metal and light. Some existed as patterns of energy with no physical form at all. Yet they all shared the same confusion, same wonder, same fear. The being who spoke first was older than most stars. It had watched galaxies form and die. It had seen species rise from mud and evolve into gods. It had thought it understood the limits of consciousness, the boundaries of what mind could do. It said that the humans had broken those boundaries. It said that emotion was not supposed to travel faster than light. Mind was not supposed to affect space and time directly. These were laws that had held true for billions of years. And in a single moment, species that had not even mastered basic space travel had proven those laws wrong. The second speaker was a collective, a civilization of trillions of individuals who shared a single consciousness. They spoke of how the shockwave had felt when it passed through them. They described it as a scream, a prayer, and a demand all at once. They said it had reminded them of their own early days, before they learned to control their emotions, before they became calm and logical and cold. The third speaker was a machine intelligence, a mind born from silicon and light. It had no emotions of its own, but it had studied emotion in other species for millions of years. It said that what the humans had done should not have been possible. The energy required to send such a signal would have required the entire output of their sun. Yet they had done it with nothing but feeling. One by one, the council members shared their thoughts. Some were afraid. They argued that the humans were too dangerous, too unpredictable. A species that could bend reality with pure emotion might someday become powerful enough to threaten anyone. Better to destroy them now, while they were still confined to their single world. Others disagreed. They said that fear was what led to the worst decisions. They reminded the council of the species they had destroyed in the past and how those decisions still haunted them. They said that the humans had not attacked anyone. Their shockwave had carried no violence, only pain and anger, and a desperate wish to be heard. The debate went on for days, measured by human time. The council members explored every possibility, every scenario, every future they could imagine. Some of these futures were dark, showing the humans growing powerful and dangerous, spreading war across the galaxy. But others were bright, showing the humans bringing new energy and passion to a universe that had grown tired and old. In the end, they made their decision. They would not destroy the humans. They would not ignore them. They would answer. The message they composed was simple. They knew the humans could not understand their languages or their mathematics, not yet. But they had received human emotion, and they could send emotion back. They would reply in a way that any feeling creature could understand. While the council debated, Earth continued to change. The first month after the shockwave was the hardest. The old systems had collapsed, and the new ones had not yet formed. Food was scarce in some places. Medicine was hard to find. The infrastructure that humans had depended on for generations was broken, and fixing it required knowledge that had been hoarded by the few. But humans were creative, and they were no longer alone in their struggles. The connection that the shockwave had created between minds had not faded. People could feel each other's needs. When one community had extra food, they knew somehow where it should go. When doctors were needed, they found their way to the sick, as if guided by invisible hands. New leaders emerged, but they were different from the old ones. They did not seek power for its own sake. They could not, because everyone could feel their true intentions. Anyone who tried to manipulate or control others felt the immediate resistance of millions of minds. Pushing back against the lie, the corrupt ones who had survived the early days of the change tried to adapt. They learned to hide their feelings, to mask their greed behind walls of practiced emotion. But these masks always slipped eventually. The human mind was not designed for constant deception, and the new sensitivity that people had developed could detect even the smallest cracks in a false face. Slowly, painfully, honestly, humanity began to rebuild. They did not rebuild the old world. That world had been based on competition and fear, on the idea that there was not enough for everyone and that survival meant taking from others. The new world they imagined was different. It was based on the simple truth they had learned through their connected pain. When one person suffers, everyone suffers. When one person thrives, everyone can share in that success. It was not a perfect world. Humans still argued and disagreed. They still made mistakes and hurt each other in small ways. The anger that had started everything still flared up sometimes, especially when people remembered what had been done to them. But now, they had tools to work through that anger. They could feel each other's perspectives. They could understand, truly understand, why someone else might see things differently. Scientists began to study what had happened. They found that the shockwave had changed something in human brains, creating new neural pathways that allowed for a kind of emotional communication that had never existed before. They called it empathic resonance, but most people just called it the connection. The connection was not telepathy. People could not read each other's thoughts or see each other's memories, but they could feel the general emotional state of people near them. And if they focused, they could sense stronger emotions from people far away. It was like having a new sense, one that showed the emotional weather of humanity. Some people struggled with this new ability. The noise of 7 billion emotional states could be overwhelming. They had to learn to filter, to focus, to protect themselves from being drowned in the feelings of others. Centers were established to help people cope, places of quiet where they could learn to manage their new sensitivity. Others embraced the connection completely. They discovered that groups of people focusing together could achieve things that individuals never could. They could solve problems through collective intuition. They could create art that spoke directly to the soul. They could heal emotional wounds that had festered for generations. 2 months after the shockwave, a young woman in Argentina noticed something strange. She was a radio astronomer, one of the few who had continued working during the chaos. Her equipment had been damaged, but she had repaired it herself, driven by a feeling she could not explain, a certainty that she needed to keep listening. What she found made her hands tremble as she checked and rechecked her data. There was a signal coming from outside the solar system. It was not random noise or natural phenomenon. It was structured, purposeful, clearly artificial. Someone was sending a message to Earth. She shared her discovery. And within hours, the news had spread across the planet. The connection carried it faster than any electronic communication could. People stopped what they were doing and looked up at the sky. They did not know what the message said yet, but they could feel something coming, something that would change their world once again. They were not afraid. They had faced their own darkness and survived. They had screamed their pain into the void and found strength in their unity. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The universe had heard them. And now, the universe was answering. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, but by then, most humans had stopped counting days the old way. Time felt different now that they were connected. Hours passed more slowly when filled with shared experience, and weeks flew by when communities worked together toward common goals. Every radio, telescope on Earth received the signal at the same moment. It was encoded in mathematics, the only language that beings from different worlds could share. But beneath the mathematics was something else, something that did not need to be decoded. It was feeling pure and clear, carried across the vast distances of space. The feeling said, "We hear you. You are not alone. Your anger was valid and your pain was real. You have announced yourself to the cosmos, and we welcome you." When humans felt this message, many of them wept. They had spent their entire history looking up at the stars and wondering if anyone else was out there. They had sent probes and signals and hopes into the darkness, never knowing if any of it would be received. And now, finally, they had their answer. They were not alone. They had never been alone. The scientists worked to decode the mathematical content of the message. It took 3 days, with minds around the world collaborating through the connection. What they found was an invitation. The beings who had sent the message wanted to meet. They wanted to welcome humanity into what they called the community of worlds, but there was a condition. The message made it clear that humanity was not ready yet. They were still too young, too raw, too likely to be damaged by contact with civilizations far older and more powerful. The message said that observers would come to Earth first. They would watch and learn and help, and when humanity was ready, they would be invited to take their place among the stars. Some people were disappointed. They wanted to see alien worlds, to travel through space, to experience wonders beyond imagination. But most understood. They had just emerged from the greatest transformation in human history. They were still learning what it meant to be connected. They needed time to grow into their new selves before they could grow into a new role in the universe. The observers arrived 1 month later. They came in a ship that appeared suddenly in orbit around the moon, as if it had stepped from one place to another without crossing the space between. The ship was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at, its surfaces shifting and flowing, like liquid metal caught in eternal motion. The beings inside the ship did not show themselves at first. They communicated through the same emotional channel that humans had accidentally opened with their shockwave. They introduced themselves not with names or words, but with feelings. They were ancient and patient. They were curious and kind. They were lonely in ways that humans were just beginning to understand. They explained that they had been watching Earth for a long time. They had seen humans struggle and fail and try again. They had seen the cruelty and the greed, but they had also seen the love and the sacrifice. They had hoped that humans would find their way through the darkness, but they had not been allowed to interfere. The laws of the community forbade helping species that had not yet proven themselves. The shockwave had changed everything. By uniting their anger and sending it out into the universe, humans had proven that they were capable of something rare and precious. They had shown that individual minds could become something greater when they worked together. They had demonstrated the power of emotion, something that many older civilizations had forgotten or abandoned long ago. The observers said that humanity had reminded them of things they had lost. In their long journey toward wisdom and power, many civilizations had left their emotions behind. They had become calm and logical and eternal, but also cold and tired and empty. The human shockwave had stirred something in them, something they had not felt for millions of years. It had made them feel young again. Humans spent the next years learning from the observers. They learned that the universe was full of life, far more than they had ever imagined. They learned that many civilizations had risen and fallen, that the survivors had found ways to live in harmony with each other and with the cosmos. They learned about technologies that seemed like magic and ideas that stretched their minds to breaking. But the most important lessons were not about science or technology. They were about what it meant to be part of something larger than yourself. The observers taught that consciousness was the rarest and most precious thing in the universe. Stars were common. Planets were everywhere. But minds that could wonder and hope and feel were treasures beyond counting. Every thinking being was valuable, not because of what they could do or what they owned, but simply because they existed. Humans had always believed this in theory, but they had rarely lived it in practice. Now, with the connection binding them together and the eyes of the universe watching, they began to truly understand. Every person mattered. Every emotion was real. Every life deserved dignity and care. The old divisions did not disappear overnight. There were still people who clung to the old ways, who tried to rebuild the walls that had fallen. But they found less and less support as the years passed. The young people who had grown up after the shockwave could not understand why anyone would want to return to separation and fear. To them, the connection was as natural as breathing. 10 years after the shockwave, humanity celebrated a new holiday. They called it Awakening Day, and they marked it not with speeches or parades, but with silence. For 1 hour, people around the world stopped what they were doing and focused on the connection. They felt each other's presence. All 7 billion minds joined in peaceful awareness. They remembered the anger that had started everything. They transformed that memory into gratitude. They were grateful for the pain that had taught them empathy. They were grateful for the lies that had finally been exposed. They were grateful for the anger that had shaken the universe and brought them Together, the observers watched these celebrations with something that felt like pride. They had seen many species join the community of worlds, but they had never seen one do it quite like this. Humans had not earned their place through conquest or invention. They had earned it through feeling, through connection, through the simple act of caring about each other enough to scream into the void together. As the decade ended, the message came that humanity had been waiting for. The community of worlds had decided that humans were ready. They were invited to send representatives to a gathering of civilizations, to take their place among beings who had walked the stars for millions of years. The representatives they chose were not politicians or scientists or celebrities. They were ordinary people, selected because of how they felt rather than what they knew. A grandmother from Korea who had lost everything in the old world and helped build a new community from the ashes. A young man from Nigeria who could feel the emotions of others more clearly than anyone else. A child from Brazil who had been born after the shockwave and had never known a world without connection. As these representatives prepared to leave Earth, people gathered to watch the ship that would carry them to the stars. It was a human ship now, built with knowledge shared by the observers but made by human hands. It was not as beautiful as the alien vessel, but it was beautiful in its own way, symbol of how far humanity had come. The grandmother spoke before they departed. She said that she was not afraid. She said that humans had faced their own darkness and emerged stronger. She said that whatever they found among the stars, they would face it the way they faced everything now. Together, connected as one people, the ship rose into the sky, carrying humanity's first ambassadors to the universe. On the ground below, billions of people watched and felt a shared emotion that was hard to name. It was pride and hope and wonder, mixed with the old anger that would never fully fade. The anger that had started everything. They had sent shockwaves across the universe with their fury. Now they were ready to send something else. They were ready to send their love, their curiosity, their endless capacity for growth and change. The stars were waiting, and humanity, finally united, finally healed, finally ready, went out to meet them. In the years that followed, people would often look up at the night sky and remember the time before. They would remember the lies and the pain and the moment when everything had broken. And they would be grateful because the breaking had been the beginning. The anger had sent shockwaves across the universe. But what came after the anger was even more powerful. Connection, understanding, love, and the universe. Ancient and vast and no longer quite so empty, embraced them like children finally coming home.